And now I found myself in great distress. What little I had in the world was all in money, except a little plate, some linen, and my clothes. And it came in my thoughts one morning that I would go to the bank myself, where I had often been to receive the interest of some bills I had, and where I had found the clerk, to whom I applied myself, very honest and just to me. I went to him and asked if he would trouble himself to be my adviser, who was a poor friendless widow, and knew not what to do. He told me that he would help me to a good, sober person, who was a grave man of his acquaintance, whose honesty I might depend upon. And he appointed the same evening for me to meet him and his friend. And indeed, as soon as I saw his friend, I was fully satisfied that I had a very honest man to deal with. Accordingly, I met him the next day, and I told him my circumstances at large. He told me I might lodge the money in the bank as an account, and I found such a sincere, disinterested honesty in him that I told him with a great deal of frankness that I had never met with man or woman yet that I could trust, and I would freely trust him with the management of that little I had. He asked me how I came to have so much goodwill for him, and, looking very much pleased, said he might very lawfully wish he was a single man for my sake. But, says he, I have a wife, and no wife, and indeed you don't know what I am, or what she is. For, says he, to be plain with you, I am a cuckold, and she is a whore, and I am no contented cuckold neither. But she that will be a whore will be a whore. Madam, says he, she is a whore not by necessity, but by inclination. At last he looked steadily at me. Look you, madam, says he, you came to ask advice of me, but I must turn the tables, and I think I must ask advice of you. Tell me, what must a poor, abused fellow do with a whore? Alas, sir, says I, 'tis a case too nice for me to advise in, but it seems she has run away from you, so you are rid of her fairly. No, no, says he, but I would be rid of her, so that I might marry again. Well, sir, says I, then you must divorce her. That's very tedious and expensive, says he. Why, says I, if you can get any woman you like to take your word, I suppose your wife would not dispute the liberty with you that she takes herself. Aye, says he, but 'twould be hard to bring an honest woman to do that. And then he turned short upon me. Will you take me, madam? That's not a fair question, says I. I shall answer you plainly. No, not I. My business is of another kind with you. 'Tis easy to give advice in your case. If your case is so plain as you say it is, you may be legally divorced, and then you may find honest women enough to ask the question of fairly. I came to you about my own business. I beg of you, let me know what you will advise me to do. I will be prepared, says he, against you come again. Nay, says I, you have forbid my coming any more, because you can't expect I should visit you on the account you talk of. Well, says he, you shall promise me to come again, however, and I will not say any more of it till I have gotten the divorce, but you shall be the woman, or I will not be divorced at all. He could not have said anything in the world that pleased me better. I came the next evening accordingly, and I found, and was not a little pleased with it, that he had provided a supper for me. He laid his business very home indeed. He protested his affection to me, and indeed I had no room to doubt it. He then told me he had a proposal to make to me, that I would marry him, and to satisfy me that he meant honourably, he would promise not to desire me to live with him. But I convinced him it was not a proposal that had any sense in it. I played with this lover as an angler does with a trout. In short, I ventured to avoid signing a contract of marriage, and the reason why I did it was because the lady that had invited me so earnestly to go with her into Lancashire promised me such great fortunes and such fine things there that I was tempted to go and try. And so I told him I would go into the north, that he should know where to write to me. Well, I went with my friend, as I called her, into Lancashire, and we came to a gentleman's seat where was a numerous family, extraordinary company indeed, and where she was called cousin. I stayed there about 6 weeks, and then my conductor led me back to a country village about 6 miles from Liverpool, where her brother, as she called him, came to visit me in his own chariot. And the next thing was to make love to me. And in all appearance this brother was a match worth my listening to, and the least his estate was valued at was £1,000 a year. But the sister said it was worth £1,500 a year, and lay most of it in Ireland. I, that was a great fortune, or passed for such, was above being asked how much my estate was, and my false friend, taking it upon a foolish hearsay, had raised it from £500 to £5,000, and by the time she came into the country, she called it £15,000. To cut this story short, I consented to be married. And after we'd been married about a month, the Irishman, as I called him, began to talk of my going to West Chester in order to embark for Ireland. However, he did not hurry me, for we stayed near 3 weeks longer, and then he sent to Chester for a coach to meet us, and we lodged at an inn. Here, my spouse, talking of my going to Ireland, asked me if I had no affairs to settle at London. I told him no, not of any great consequence, but what might be done as well by letter from Dublin. "Madam," says he very respectfully, "I suppose the greatest part of your estate, which my sister tells me is most of it in money, lies secure enough, but in case it required transferring, it might be necessary to go up to London." I seemed to look strange at it, and told him I knew not what he meant. And it presently occurred to me that my friend had represented me in colours which were not my due, and I thought I would know the bottom of it before I went out of England. Upon this, I called his sister into my chamber the next morning, and I conjured with her to tell me what she had said to her brother. She owned that she had told him that I was a great fortune, and said that she was told so at London. "Told so?" says I, warmly. "Did I ever tell you so?" "No," she said. At these words, my husband and her brother, as she called him, came into the room, and I desired him to come and sit down. "I am afraid," says I, "my dear, that you have a very great abuse put upon you. I have been now asking your sister if ever I told her of any fortune or estate I had, and she owns I never did. She could not deny one word, but said she had been told in London that I had a very great fortune, and that it lay in the Bank of England. And now, dear sir," said I, turning myself to my new spouse again, "be so just as to tell me who has abused both you and me so much as to make you believe I was a fortune." He could not speak a word, but pointed to her, and then flew around in the most furious passion that ever I saw a man in my life, cursing that she had ruined him. He then added, directing his speech to me, that she was none of his sister, but had been his whore for 2 years. And then he said he was afraid we were both undone, for to be plain, my dear, I have no estate. At this moment my sister got out of the room, and I never saw her more. I was confounded now as much as he, and knew not what to say. He rise before me in the morning, and indeed, having lain awake almost all night, I was very sleepy, and lay till near 11 o'clock. In this time away he went, leaving a short but moving letter for me on the table, as follows. "My dear, I am a dog. I have abused you, but I have been drawn in to do it by a base creature. Forgive me, my dear. Our marriage is nothing. I here discharge you from it. If you can marry to your advantage, do not decline it on my account. I have put some of the stock of money I have left into your pocket. Adieu, my dear, forever. I am yours most affectionately, J.E. Nothing that ever befell me in my life sunk so deep into my heart as this farewell. After dinner I fell into a vehement fit of crying, calling him by his name, which was James. "Oh, Jemmy," said I, "come back, come back." And when it was near dusk in the evening, to my unspeakable surprise, he comes back into the inn, and it was impossible to conceal my joy. He was no sooner entered the room, but he run to me and took me in his arms, holding me fast. And he told me he was gone about 15 miles, but it was not in his power to go any farther without coming back to see me again. He came with me as far as Dunstable, within 30 miles of London, and then he told me fate and his own misfortunes obliged him to leave me. The stagecoach we were in did not usually stop at Dunstable, but I, desiring it but for a quarter of an hour, they were content to stand at an inn door a while, and we went into the house. Being in the inn, I told him I had but one favour more to ask of him, and that was that since he could not go any farther, he would give me leave to stay a week or two in the town with him. This was too reasonable a proposal to be denied, so he called the landlady of the house and told her his wife was taken ill. Here I told my husband that I would live with him now till all my money was spent, but would not let him spend a shilling of his own. And he acquiesced. We parted at last, after near a month, though with the utmost reluctance on my side, and indeed he took his leave very unwillingly too. I came to London the next day, but did not go directly to my old lodgings, but, for another nameless reason, took a private lodging in St. John's Street, or, as it is vulgarly called, St. James's, near Clerkenwell. And here, being perfectly alone, I had leisure to sit down and reflect. But that pleasure was very much lessened when I found some time after that I was really with child. Now, I had taken care all this while to preserve a correspondence with my honest friend at the bank. I was not displeased with the news that his process of divorce was more tedious than he expected, for, though I was in no condition to have had him yet, I was not willing to lose him. I now grew big, and the people where I lodged perceived it, and intimated that I must think of removing, and I began to be melancholy, for I had money but no friends, and was like now to have a child upon my hands. In the course I fell very ill, and the gentlewoman who kept the house proposed to me to send for a midwife, for it seems the mistress of the house was not so great a stranger to such cases as mine. "Madam," says the midwife, "you are under some circumstances that may render your lying in difficult to you. I, perhaps, may be in a condition to assist you and remove all your dull thoughts upon the subject." Every word this creature said was a cordial to me. I told her my case was partly as she guessed, and partly not, for I was really married and had a husband. But I found presently that whether I was a whore or a wife, I was to pass for a whore here, so I let that go. As soon as I was well enough to go abroad, I went with the maid to see the apartment I was to have, and as I had money, everything was so handsome and so clean and well that, in short, I had nothing to say. And so, to bring this part into as narrow a compass as possible, I quitted my lodging at St. James's and went to my new governess, and there I was indeed treated with much courtesy. While I was here, and before I was brought to bed, I received a letter from my trustee at the bank, full of kind, obliging things, and earnestly pressing me to return to London. It was near a fortnight old when it came to me, because it had been first sent into Lancashire and then returned to me. He concludes with telling me that he had obtained a decree against his wife, and that he would be ready to make good his engagement to me, if I would accept him. I returned an answer to this letter, and dated it at Liverpool, but sent it by a messenger, alleging that it came in cover to a friend in town, without giving any answer to his proposal of my coming to London to him, but mentioned at a distance my intention to return the latter end of the year, this being dated in April. I was brought to bed about the middle of May, and had another brave boy, and I think I had been brought to bed about 22 days when I received another letter from my friend at the bank, with the surprising news that he had obtained a final sentence of divorce against his wife, and that he had such an answer to give to all my scruples about his marrying again as I could not expect, and as he had no desire of, for that his wife had very unhappily destroyed herself that same evening. I was exceedingly surprised at the news, and began now seriously to reflect on my present circumstances, and at last I opened my case at a distance to my governess. She fell a-laughing at my scruples about marrying, and told me the other was no marriage, but a cheat on both sides, and that as we were parted by mutual consent, the nature of the contract was destroyed, and, in short, reasoned me out of my reason. But then came the great and main difficulty, and that was the child. This, she told me in so many words, must be removed. I knew there was no marrying without entirely concealing that I had had a child, but it touched my heart so forcibly to think of parting entirely with the child that I could not think of it without horror. I represented to my governess all the dark thoughts which I had upon me about it, and at last my old governess came to me with her usual assurance. "Come, my dear," says she, "I have found out a way how you shall be at a certainty. If you are willing to be at some small annual expense, you shall be secure. You shall once or twice a year go with me and see your child, and see how 'tis used, and be satisfied that it is in good hands, nobody knowing who you are." I was very well pleased with this. So the next week a countrywoman was brought from Hertford, or thereabouts, who was to take the child off our hands entirely. I then began to write to my friend at the bank in a more kindly style, and that I purposed to be in town sometime in August. He returned me an answer in the most passionate terms imaginable, and desired me to let him have timely notice, and he would come and meet me 2 days' journey. This puzzled me scurvily, and I did not know what answer to make to it. But I was resolved to take the stagecoach to Westchester on purpose only to have the satisfaction of coming back, that he might see me really come in the same coach. For I had a jealous thought, though I had no ground for it at all, lest he should think I was not really in the country. I took the place in the coach, not to its full extent, but to a place called Stone in Cheshire, and took passage back again for London, sending a letter to my gentleman, and he met me at a place called Brick Ill the next morning, as we were just coming into the town. I confess I was very glad to see him, and he pleased me doubly, too, by the figure he came in, for he brought a very handsome gentleman's coach and 4 horses, with a servant to attend him. He took me out of the stagecoach immediately, and, putting into the same inn, he set up his own coach and bespoke his dinner. I was then for going forward with the journey, but he said no, I had need of a little rest upon the road. I did not press him much, for since he had come so far to meet me, it was but reasonable I should oblige him a little. So after dinner we walked to see the town, to see the church, and to view the fields, and our landlord was our guide. I observed my gentleman inquired pretty much about the parson, and I took the hint immediately that he certainly would propose to be married. But while this thought run round in my head, which was the work but of a few moments, I observed my landlord took him aside and whispered to him, "Sir, if you shall have occasion for a minister, I have a friend a little way off that will serve you, and be as private as you please." My gentleman answered loud enough for me to hear, "Very well, I believe I shall." I was no sooner come back to the inn, but he fell upon me with irresistible words, that since he had had the good fortune to meet me, it would be hastening his felicity if I would put an end to the matter just there. "What do you mean?" says I, colouring a little. "What, in an inn and upon the road? How can you talk so?" "Oh, I can talk so very well," says he, and with that he pulls out a great bundle of papers and laid them all abroad. There was first the deed or sentence of divorce from his wife, and the full evidence of her playing the whore. Then there was the certificates of the minister and church wardens of the parish where she lived, proving that she was buried, and intimating the manner of her death. The copy of the coroner's warrant for a jury to sit upon her, and the verdict of the jury, who brought it in non compos mentis. But there were other papers rolled up, and I asked him what they were. So he unrolls them and takes out a little shagreen case, and gives me out of it a very fine diamond ring. I could not refuse it, if I had a mind to do so, for he put it upon my finger. So I made him a curtsy and accepted it. Then he takes out another ring, and this, says he, is for another occasion. Then he took up the roll again and read it, and behold, it was a licence for us to be married. Why, says I, are you distracted? No, no, says he, how can you think so? I must not be denied. I can't be denied. And with that he fell to kissing me violently. There was a bed in the room, and at last he takes me by surprise in his arms, and threw me on the bed, and himself with me, and holding me fast in his arms, but without the least offer of any undecency, courted me to consent. He was so transported with my consent, he thanked me for my kind yielding to him, and was so overcome with the satisfaction and joy of it, that I saw tears stand in his eyes. Well, if I must be his wife, I'll be a true wife to him, and love him suitably. I will make him amends for the cheats and abuses I put upon him, which he does not see. But my gentleman was impatient for my coming out of my chamber, and finding me long, he went downstairs and talked with my landlord about the parson. My landlord, an officious though well-meaning fellow, had sent away for the neighbouring clergyman, and he asked him if he would venture to marry a couple of strangers that were both willing. The parson said that he hoped it was no clandestine business. To put you out of doubt of that, says my gentleman, read this paper, and out he pulls the licence. I am satisfied, says the minister. Where is the lady? You shall see her presently, says my gentleman. So up they brings the parson, and a very good sort of a gentleman he was. Well, sir, says the parson, I am pleased. Landlord, have you a common prayer book? I started as if I had been frightened. Lord, says I, what do you mean? What, to marry in an inn, and at night too? I was a great while before I could be persuaded, but I seemed, at last, to be prevailed on. We could not find it in our hearts to stir the next day, for in short, having been disturbed by the bells in the morning, and having perhaps not slept over much before, we were so sleepy afterwards that we lay in bed till almost 12 o'clock. But an odd passage interrupted all my mirth for a good while. The great room of the house looked into the street, and my new spouse being below stair, I had opened the window and was standing at it for some air, when I saw 3 gentlemen come by on horseback and go into an inn just against us. It was not to be concealed, nor was it so doubtful as to leave me any room to question it, but the second of the 3 was my Lancashire husband, and I was frightened to death. The first sensible reflection I made was that my husband was not to see my disorder. Yet every moment I fancied my Lancashire husband was coming up the stairs to insult me. At last, hearing a great clatter in the passage of their inn, I run to the window, and to my great satisfaction see them all 3 go out again and travel on toward London. We were resolved to be going the next day, but about 6 o'clock at night we were alarmed with a great uproar in the street for 3 highwaymen that had robbed 2 coaches and some other travellers near Dunstable Hill. The house was immediately beset and searched. I was heartily concerned, and I presently told the constable that I saw the 3 gentlemen, and I could assure him I knew one of them to be such a man that he was a gentleman of very good estate. The assurance with which I delivered this gave the mob gentry a check, and gave the constable such satisfaction that he immediately sounded a retreat. Well, this alarm stopped us another day, though my spouse was for travelling, but I was afraid and uneasy, and indeed principally lest my old acquaintance should be upon the road still. We came away then the 5th day, and I made no scruple of going directly home with my gentleman, and there I took possession at once of a house well furnished and a husband in very good circumstances, so that I had the prospect of a very happy life. I lived with this husband in an uninterrupted course of ease and content for 5 years, when a sudden blow from an almost invisible hand blasted all my happiness and turned me out into the world in a condition the reverse of all that had been before it. My husband, having trusted one of his fellow clerks with a sum of money too much for our fortunes to bear the loss of, the clerk failed, and the loss fell very heavy on my husband. He grew melancholy, and from thence lethargic, and died. I foresaw the blow, for I saw evidently that if he died, I was undone. I had had 2 children by him, and no more. For to tell the truth, it began to be the time for me to leave bearing children, for I was now 48. I was now left in a dismal and disconsolate case indeed. In this distress I sat down and cried and tormented myself night and day, wringing my hands, and sometimes raving like a distracted woman. I lived 2 years in this dismal condition, wasting that little I had, weeping continually over my dismal circumstances. For a little relief I had put off my house and took lodgings, and I sold off most of my goods, which put a little money in my pocket, and I lived near a year upon that, spending very sparingly. But still, when I looked before me, my very heart would sink within me. It was one evening when, being brought, as I may say, to the last gasp, I think I may truly say I was distracted and raving, when, prompted by I know not what spirit, and, as it were, doing I did not know what or why, I dressed me. Wandering thus about, I knew not whither, I passed by an apothecary's shop in Leadenhall Street, where I saw, lying on a stool just before the counter, a little bundle. Beyond it stood a maidservant with her back to it, looking up towards the top of the shop, where the apothecary's apprentice, as I suppose, was standing up on the counter. This was the bait, and the devil prompted me like a voice spoken to me over my shoulder, "Take the bundle." What the bundle was made up for, or on what occasion laid where I found it, I knew not, but when I came to open it, I found there was a suit of child-bed linen in it, very good and almost new, the lace very fine. There was a silver porringer of a pint, a small silver mug and 6 spoons, some other linen, a good smock, and 3 silk handkerchiefs, and in the mug, wrapped up in a paper, 18 shillings and 6pence in money. I sat me down and cried most vehemently. I knew not what I said or did all night and all the next day. But then I was impatient to hear some news of the loss, whether they were a poor body's goods or a rich. For perhaps, said I, it may be some poor widow like me that had packed up these goods. But my own distresses silenced all these reflections. It was then particularly heavy upon my mind that I had been reformed, and had, as I hoped, repented of all my past wickednesses. But now I should be driven by the dreadful necessity of my circumstances to the gates of destruction. And I reflected on my past life as not sincerely repented of, that heaven was now beginning to punish me on this side of the grave. Had I gone on here, I had perhaps been a true penitent. But I had an evil counsellor within, and he was continually prompting me to relieve myself by the worst means. So one evening he tempted me again by the same wicked impulse. I had a great many adventures after this, but I was young in the business, and I was now at a loss for a market for my goods. At last I resolved to go to my old governess and acquaint myself with her again. I now made her a visit, and I found that she drove something of the old trade still, but that she was not in such flourishing circumstances as before. Indeed, she was turned pawnbroker, though she still lived pretty well. I told her I had not much money left, but that I had some things that were money's worth. I now began to think this necessary woman might help me a little in my low condition to some business, for I would gladly have turned my hand to any honest employment, But here she was deficient. Honest business did not come within her reach. She invited me at last to come and be at her house till I could find something to do. And now, living a little easier, I entered into some measures to have my little son by my last husband taken off. And this she made easy too. At last I got some quilting work for ladies' beds, petticoats and the like, and this I liked very well and worked very hard, and with this I began to live. But the diligent devil who resolved I should continue in his service continually prompted me to go out. One evening I blindly obeyed his summons, and fetched a long circuit through the streets, but met with no purchase, and came home very weary. But not content with that, I went out the next evening too, when, going by an ale-house, I saw the door of a little room open next the very street, and on the table a silver tankard. It seems some company had been drinking there, and the careless boys had forgot to take it away. I came home to my governess, and now I thought it was a time to try her. I told her I had a secret of the greatest consequence in the world to commit to her, if she had respect enough for me to keep it a secret. I told her the strangest thing in the world had befallen me, and that it had made a thief of me. And so I told her the story of the tankard. "And have you brought it away with you, my dear?" says she. "To be sure I have," says I, and showed it her. "But what shall I do now?" says I. "Must not I carry it again?" "Carry it again," says she. "Aye, if you are minded to be sent to Newgate for stealing it." "Child," says she, "I wish you could light of such a bargain once a week." This gave me a new notion of my governess, and that since she was turned pawnbroker, she had a sort of people about her that were none of the honest ones that I had met with there before, and who brought in all kind of ware, not to be pawned, but to be sold downright. I found also that in the following this trade, she always melted down the plate she bought. And she came to me and told me one morning that she was going to melt, and if I would, she would put my tankard in. So she weighed it, and allowed me the full value in silver. Some time after this, as I was at work, and very melancholy, she begins to ask me what the matter was. I told her my heart was heavy, I had little work, and nothing to live on. She laughed, and told me I must go out again and try my fortune. "Oh, mother," says I, "that is a trade I have no skill in, and if I should be taken, I am undone at once." Says she, "I could help you to a schoolmistress that shall make you as dexterous as herself." And thus the devil, who began by the help of an irresistible poverty to push me into this wickedness, brought me on to a height beyond the common rate, even when my necessities were not so great. And my new partner in wickedness and I went on together so long without being ever detected that we not only grew bold, but we grew rich. And as poverty brought me into the mire, so avarice kept me in, till there was no going back. Thus I, that was once in the devil's clutches, was held fast there, as with a charm, till I was engulfed in labyrinths of trouble, too great to get out at all. My comrade, as I called her, with another of her scholars, was the first in the misfortune. For happening to be upon the hunt for purchase, they made an attempt upon a linen draper in Cheapside, but were snapped by a hawk's-eye journeyman and seized with 2 pieces of cambric, which were taken also upon them. This was enough to lodge them both in Newgate. And oh, could I have but taken warning! This terrible example of my comrade frighted me heartily, and for a good while I made no excursions. But one night in the neighbourhood of my governess's house they cried, "Fire!" My governess looked out, cried immediately that such a gentlewoman's house was all of a light fire atop. Here she gives me a jog. "Now, child," says she, "there is a rare opportunity, the fire being so near that you may go to it before the street is blocked up with the crowd, and run in and tell the lady or anybody you see that you come to help them." Away I went, and coming to the house, I found them all in confusion. I run in, and finding one of the maids, "Lord, sweetheart," said I, "how came this dismal accident? Where is your mistress, and how does she do? Is she safe? And where are the children?" Away runs the maid. "Madam, madam," says she, screaming as loud as she could yell, "here is a gentlewoman come to help us." The poor woman, half out of her wits, with a bundle under her arm and 2 little children, comes towards me. "Lord, madam," says I, "let me carry the poor children to your friend." And immediately I takes one of them out of her hand, and she lifts the t'other up into my arms. "I do, God bless her and thank her. Take this bundle of plate and carry it to her too." I then walked to the upper end of the street and thundered at the door with the children, and as the people were raised before by the noise of the fire, I was soon let in, and I said, "Is madam awake? Pray tell her the mother of these poor children desires the favour of her to take these children in." One of the maids asked me if I was not to leave the bundle too. I said, "No, sweetheart, 'tis to go to another place." I was in a great way out of the hurry now, and so I went on, clear of anybody's inquiry, and brought the bundle of plate, which was very considerable, straight home, and gave it to my old governess. I began now to have a new tempter, who prompted me every day. I mean my governess, who, to give a short touch at her history, though she had left off the trade, was, as I may say, born a pickpocket. And I so well followed her from now on that I grew the greatest artist of my time. I had now practised upwards of 5 years, and the people at Newgate did not so much as know me. They had heard much of me, indeed, and often expected me there, but I always got off. One of the greatest dangers I was now in was that I was too well known among the trade, and some of them, whose hatred was owing rather to envy than any injury I had done them, began to be angry that I should always escape. These were they that gave me the name of MOLL FLANDERS, for it was no more of affinity with my real name, or with any of the names I'd ever gone by, than black is of kin to white, except that once, as before, I had called myself Mrs. Flanders. I could fill up this whole discourse with the variety of adventures which daily invention directed to, and which I managed with the utmost dexterity, and always with success. At length, as when does the pitcher come safe home that goes so very often to the well, I fell into some broils, which, though they could not affect me fatally, yet made me known, which was the worst thing next to being found guilty that could befall me. I was now in good circumstances indeed, if I could have known my time for leaving off. And my governess often said I was the richest of the trade in England, and so I believe I was. Now, it was 3 days after one Christmas day that, not at all made cautious by my former danger as I used to be, I ventured into a house where I saw the doors open, and furnished myself, as I thought verily without being perceived, with 2 pieces of flowered silks. It was not a mercer's shop, but looked like a private dwelling house, and was, it seems, inhabited by a man that sold goods for the weavers to the mercers, like a broker or factor. That I may make short of this black part of this story, I was attacked by 2 wenches that came open-mouthed at me just as I was going out of the door, and one of them pulled me back into the room while the other shut the door upon me. I would have given them good words, but there was no room for it. The mistress of the house came next, and then the master, and all outrageous. I gave the master very good words, told him the door was open, and things were a temptation to me, that I was poor and distressed, and poverty was what many could not resist, and begged him with tears to have pity on me. The mistress of the house was moved with compassion, and inclined to have let me go. But the saucy wenches were run even before they were sent, and had fetched a constable. The sight of the constable struck me with terror, and I thought I should have sunk into the ground. I fell into faintings, and indeed the people themselves thought I would have died, when the woman argued again for me, and entreated her husband, seeing they had lost nothing, to let me go. And when I came to the justice, and pleaded there that I had neither broken anything to get in, nor carried anything out, The justice was inclined to have released me. But the first saucy jade that stopped me, affirming that I was going out with the goods, but that she stopped me and pulled me back as I was upon the threshold, the justice upon that point committed me, and I was carried to Newgate. My very blood chills at the mention of its name. The place where so many of my comrades had been locked up, and from whence they went to the fatal tree. The place where my mother suffered so deeply, where I was brought into the world, and from whence I expected no redemption but by an infamous death. To conclude, the place that had so long expected me, and which, with so much art and success, I had so long avoided. I got no sleep for several nights or days after I came into that wretched place, and glad I would have been for some time to have died there. Oh, if I had but been sent to any place in the world and not to Newgate, I should have thought myself happy. How did the hardened wretches that were there before me triumph over me? What? Mrs. Flanders come to Newgate at last. What? Mrs. Mary? Mrs. Molly? And after that plain MOLL Flanders? They thought the devil had helped me, they said, that I had reigned so long. The same night that I was sent to Newgate, I sent the news of it to my old governess, who was surprised at it, you may be sure, and spent the night almost as ill out of Newgate as I did in it. The next morning she came to see me. She did what she could to comfort me, but she saw that was to no purpose. She immediately applied herself to all the proper methods to prevent the effects of it. But the first wench would not so much as let my governess talk with her. Then she applied to the master, that is to say, the man whose goods had been stolen, and particularly to his wife. But the man alleged he was bound by the justice that committed me. And so I lived many days here, under the utmost horror of soul. I had death, as it were, in view, and thought of nothing night and day but of gibbets and halters, evil spirits and devils. I know not how it was, but by the indefatigable application of my diligent governess, I had no bill preferred against me the first sessions, so I had another month. And without doubt this ought to have been accepted by me as so much time given me for reflection upon what was past, and preparation for what was to come. In the middle of this hardened part of my life, I had another sudden surprise, which called me back a little to that thing called sorrow. They told me one night that there was brought into the prison, late the night before, 3 highwaymen. It is not to be wondered that we prisoners were all desirous enough to see these brave topping gentlemen. Surprise I was in when the very first man that came out I knew to be my Lancashire husband. I was struck dumb at the sight. I quitted my company and retired, as much as that dreadful place suffers anybody to retire, and I cried vehemently for a great while. I grieved night and day for him, and the more for that they told me he was the captain of the gang, and that he had committed so many robberies that he would surely be hanged. I was overwhelmed with grief for him. My own case gave me no disturbance compared to this, and I loaded myself with reproaches on his account. While I was under these influences of sorrow for him, came notice to me that the next sessions approaching, there would be a bill preferred to the grand jury against me, and that I should be certainly tried for my life at the Old Bailey. My temper was touched before the hardened, wretched boldness of spirit which I had acquired in the prison abated, and conscious guilt began to flow in upon my mind. Lord, what will become of me? I thought. I shall certainly die. I shall be cast, to be sure, and there is nothing beyond that but death. I have no friends. Lord, have mercy upon me. What will become of me? I sank down when they brought me the news, and at last one of the keepers came to me privately and said with a sigh, "Well, Mrs. Flanders, you will be tried a Friday." This was but a Wednesday. "What do you intend to do?" I turned as white as a clout and said, "God knows what I shall do. For my part, I know not what to do." "Why," says he, "I won't flatter you. I would have you prepare for death, for I doubt you will be cast. And as they say you are an old offender, I doubt you will find but little mercy," says he. "Send for a minister and talk with him." This was plain dealing indeed, but it was very harsh to me. At least I thought it so. He left me in the greatest confusion imaginable, and all that night I lay awake. And now I began to say my prayers, which I had scarce done before since my last husband's death. Lord, what will become of me? Lord, I shall be hanged. Lord, have mercy upon me. And the like. My poor afflicted governess was now as much concerned as I, and a great deal more truly penitent. Well, there was no remedy. The prosecution went on, and on the Thursday I was carried down to the Sessions House, where I was arraigned, and the next day I was appointed to be tried. At the arraignment I pleaded not guilty, and well I might, for I was indicted for felony and burglary. When the trial began and the indictment was read, I would have spoke, but they told me the witnesses must be heard first. The witnesses were the two wenches, who swore I had the goods wholly in my possession, that I had hid them among my clothes, and that I was quite out of the house in the street with the goods before they took hold of me. I pleaded that I had stolen nothing, they had lost nothing, that the door was open, and I went in, seeing the goods lie there, and with design to buy. The court would not allow that by any means, and made a kind of jest of my intending to buy the goods. In short, I was found guilty of felony, but acquitted of the burglary, which was but small comfort to me. The next day I was carried down to receive the dreadful sentence, and when they came to ask what I had to say, why sentence should not pass, I stood mute. The judges sat grave, and pronounced the sentence of death upon me. I had no more spirit left in me. I had no tongue to speak, or eyes to look up either to God or man. It is rather to be thought of than expressed what was now my condition. I had nothing before me but present death, and as I had no friends to assist me, I expected nothing but to find my name in the dead warrant, which was to come down for the execution the Friday afterward of 5 more and myself. In the meantime, my poor distressed governess sent me a minister, who at her request first, and at my own afterwards, came to visit me. He exhorted me seriously to repent of all my sins, and he kneeled down and prayed with me. It was now that, for the first time, I felt any real signs of repentance. The minister's honest, friendly way of treating me unlocked all the sluices of my passions. He broke into my very soul by it, and I unravelled all the wickedness of my life to him. He visited me again the next morning, and went on with his method of explaining the terms of divine mercy, which, according to him, consisted of nothing more or more difficult than that of being sincerely desirous of it and willing to accept it. I thought I could freely have gone out that minute to execution without any uneasiness at all, casting my soul entirely into the arms of infinite mercy as a penitent. The good gentleman was so moved also in my behalf that he blessed God he had come to visit me, and resolved not to leave me till the last moment. It was no less than 12 days after our receiving sentence before any were ordered for execution, and then, upon a Wednesday, the dead warrant came down, and I found my name was among them. The good minister was sorely afflicted for me, and did what he could to comfort me. I wondered much that I did not see him all the next day, till about 4 o'clock he came to my apartment, for I had obtained this favour by the help of money. My heart leapt within me for joy when I heard his voice at the door. After having made a short excuse for his not coming, he showed me that he had obtained a favourable report from the Recorder to the Secretary of State in my particular case, and, in short, he had brought me a reprieve. The good man, having made a very Christian exhortation to me not to let the joy of my reprieve put the remembrance of my past sorrow out of my mind, stood up just before his going away, and in a very earnest manner prayed to God for me that my repentance might be made unfeigned and sincere. I joined heartily in the petition, and must needs say I had deeper impressions upon my mind all that night of the mercy of God in sparing my life. The next morning there was a sad scene indeed in the prison. The first thing I was saluted with in the morning was the tolling of the great bell at St. Sepulchre's, as they call it, which ushered in the day. As soon as it began to toll, a dismal groaning and crying was heard from the condemned hole. This was followed by a confused clamour in the house among the several sorts of prisoners, expressing their awkward sorrows for the poor creatures that were to die. It was about a fortnight after this that I had some just apprehensions that I should be included in the next dead warrant at the ensuing sessions, and it was not without great difficulty, and at last an humble petition for transportation, that I avoided it. I had now a certainty of life indeed, but with the hard conditions of being ordered for transportation. I lay in the prison near 15 weeks after this order for transportation was signed. What the reason was, I know not. But at the end of this time, I was put on board of a ship in the Thames. It may perhaps be thought trifling to enter here into a relation of all the little incidents which attended me in this interval, but something relating to me and my Lancashire husband I must not omit. He had already been carried from the master's side of the ordinary prison into the press yard, and with 3 of his comrades they were kept in custody almost 3 months. It seems they found means to bribe or buy off some of those who were expected to come in against them. After some puzzle on this account, they made a shift to get proof enough against 2 of them to carry them off, but the other 2, of which my Lancashire husband was one, still lay in suspense. I took this opportunity to satisfy my curiosity, pretending that I had been robbed in the Dunstable coach, and that I would go to see the 2 highwaymen. But when I came into the press yard, I so disguised myself and muffled my face up so that my Lancashire husband could see little of me, I said publicly that I knew them very well. Immediately it was rumoured all over the prison that MOLL Flanders would turn evidence against one of the highwaymen. Immediately my husband desired to see this Mrs. Flanders that knew him so well. I dressed myself up, as well as the best clothes that I suffered myself ever to appear in there would allow me, and went to the press yard, and turning to the keeper, I asked if I might not be admitted to talk with him alone. He said, yes, as much as I pleased, and so very civilly withdrew. As soon as he was gone, and I had shut the door, I threw off my hood, and bursting out into tears, "My dear," says I, "do you not know me?" He turned pale and stood speechless, and said no more but this, "Let me sit down." After some time, continuing in the surprise, he cast up his eyes towards me and said, "How could you be so cruel to come to me," says he, "in such a place?" I perceived by this that he knew nothing of the miserable circumstances I was in, and I told him in few words that I was far from coming to insult him, but my condition was worse than his. "Come, my dear," says I, "we have a long piece of work to do if I should be to relate my unfortunate history, but if you are disposed to hear it, you will soon conclude with me that my condition is worse than yours. When I shall tell you that I have been cast for my life 3 sessions ago, and am under sentence of death, is not my case worse than yours?" Then, indeed, he stood silent again, like one struck dumb, and after a little while he starts up. "Unhappy couple," says he, "how can this be possible?" I took him by the hand. "Come, my dear," said I, "sit down, and let us compare our sorrows." He listened most attentively to all my story, and then he gave me a long account of many of his adventures. I then inquired into the circumstances of his present case at that time, and he said that he had had some intimation that, if he would submit to transport himself, he might be admitted to it without a trial, but that he could not think of it with any temper, and thought he could much easier submit to be hanged. I used the utmost of my endeavour to persuade him. I told him that it was the easiest thing in the world for him to manage the captain of the ship I was to travel on, and a small matter of conduct, especially if there was any money to be had. And at last, with much difficulty, he gave his consent to transportation before trial. But I must return to my own case. It was in the month of February that I was, with 7 other convicts, as they calls us, delivered to a merchant that traded to Virginia. We were for that night clapped under hatches. However, when the ship cast anchor, we were allowed more liberty. When the next morning we were allowed to come upon the deck, I asked one of the officers of the ship whether I might not have the liberty to send a letter on shore. Accordingly, the boatswain came to me and asked me if my letter was ready, and I had gotten a letter ready, directed to my governess, and when I gave the boatswain the letter, I gave him a shilling with it. I took care, when I gave him the shilling, to let him see that I had a purse, and in it a pretty deal of money. I lay for 3 weeks in the ship, not knowing whether I should have my husband with me or no. But at the end of this time, behold, my husband came on board. As I was telling him how glad I was to have him once more out of their hands, he took me in his arms and acknowledged with great tenderness that I had given him the best advice possible. My governess now put on board the necessaries in her own name, took his bills for loading for them, and endorsed those bills of loading to my husband, so that we were provided for all events and for all disasters. In this condition, very cheerful and indeed joyful at being so happily accommodated as we were, we set sail, and in 42 days came safe to the coast of Virginia. It is not proper to enter here into the particulars of what part of the colony of Virginia we settled in. It may suffice to mention that we went into the great river of Potomac, and there we intended to have settled at first, though afterwards we altered our minds. After having gotten all our goods on shore and placed them in a storehouse, which with a lodging we hired at the small place or village where we landed, a little inquiry furnished me with information that Mother was dead, that my brother or husband was alive, which I confess I was not very glad to hear, but which was worse, I found he was removed from the plantation where he lived formerly, and where I lived with him, and lived with one of his sons in a plantation just by the place where we had hired a warehouse. I was a little surprised at first, but as I ventured to satisfy myself that he could not know me, I was not only perfectly easy, but had a great mind to see him, if it was possible to do so without his seeing me. In order to that, I found out by inquiry the plantation where he lived, and with a woman of that place who I got to help me, I rambled about towards the dwelling-house. I asked the woman whose plantation that was. She said it belonged to such a man, and looking out a little to our right hands, "There," says she, "is the gentleman that owns the plantation, and his father with him." "What are their Christian names?" said I. "I know not," said she, "what the old gentleman's name is, but his son's name is Humphrey." And I immediately knew that this was nobody else but my own son. It is easy to believe that I was strangely affected with this, and I began to inquire into the circumstances of the family, how the old gentlewoman, I mean my mother, died, and how she left what she had. She had been told that my mother had left a sum of money, and had tied her plantation for the payment of it, to be made good to the daughter, if ever she could be heard of, either in England or elsewhere, and that the trust was left with this son. This was news too good for me to make light of, and you may be sure filled my heart with 1,000 thoughts which course I should take. It lay heavy upon my mind night and day, so that my husband perceived it. I told him I was troubled because I found we must shift our quarters and alter our scheme of settling, for that I found I should be known. He joined with me in this, that it was by no means proper for me to make myself known to anybody in the circumstances in which we then were. I therefore considered of going to Carolina, which is the most southern colony of the English. We hired a sloop, and taking, as it were, a final farewell of Potomac River, we went, with all our cargo, over to Maryland. This was a long and unpleasant voyage, and we came to a place in 5 days' sailing. I think they called it Philip's Point, and behind when we came thither. The ship bound to Carolina was loaded and gone away but 3 days before. This was a disappointment. But, however, I that was to be discouraged with nothing, told my husband that since we could not get passage to Carolina, and that the country we was in was very fertile and good, we would, if he liked of it, see if we could find out anything for our turn where we was. We immediately went on shore, but found no conveniences just at that place, but was directed by a very honest Quaker who we found there to go to a place about 60 miles east, that is to say, nearer the mouth of the bay, where he said he lived, and where we should be accommodated, and we agreed to go. Here we bought us 2 servants, viz., an English woman-servant, just come on shore from a ship of Liverpool, and a Negro man-servant, things absolutely necessary for all people that pretended to settle in that country. This honest Quaker was very helpful to us, and when we came to the place that he proposed to us, found us out a convenient storehouse for our goods, and lodging for ourselves and our servants. And about 2 months or thereabout afterwards, by his direction, we took up a large piece of land from the governor of that country in order to form our plantation, and so we laid the thoughts of going to Carolina wholly aside. In 1 year's time, we had near 50 acres of land cleared, part of it enclosed, and some of it planted with tobacco. And now we began to look at one another, sometimes with a great deal of pleasure. Our affair was in a very good posture. We purchased of the proprietors of the colony as much land for £35, paid in ready money, as would make a sufficient plantation to employ between 50 and 60 servants, and which, being well improved, would be sufficient to us as long as we could either of us live. But our good fortune did not end here, for one day I went over the bay to the place where my brother, once a husband, lived. I was now fully resolved to go up point blank to my brother, husband, and to tell him who I was. But, not knowing what temper I might find him in, I resolved to write a letter to him first. And I said some very tender, kind things in the letter about his son. I did believe that having received this letter he would immediately give it to his son to read, I having understood his eyes being so dim that he could not see to read it. But it fell out better, for as his sight was dim, so he had allowed his son to open all letters that came. The son called the messenger in after some little stay, and asked him where the person was who gave him the letter. The messenger told him the place, which was about 7 miles off, so he bid him stay, and ordering a horse to be got ready, and 2 servants, away he came to me with the messenger. I had but a very few moments to think, for my son was at the heels of the messenger, and coming up into my lodgings, he comes directly up to me, kisses me, takes me in his arms, and embraces me with so much passion that he could not speak. "My dear mother," says he finally, "are you still alive? I never expected to have seen your face." After we had both recovered ourselves a little and were able to talk, he told me how things stood. He told me he had not showed my letter to his father, or told him anything about it, that what his grandmother left me was in his hands, and that he would do me justice to my full satisfaction. That as to his father, he was old and infirm, both in body and mind, and he questioned whether he would know how to act in an affair which was of so nice a nature. My son then inquired where I was, and how I had disposed myself. I told him I was on the Maryland side of the bay, at the plantation of a particular friend. He then told me I should go home with him and live with him if I pleased. I considered of that a little, and told him that, though it was really no little concern of me to live at a distance from him, yet I could not say it would be the most comfortable thing in the world to me to live in the house with him, and to have that unhappy object always before me. He acknowledged that I was right in all this, but then, "Dear mother," says he, "you shall be as near as you can." So he took me with him on horseback to a plantation next to his own, and where I was as well entertained as I could have been in his own. And I began secretly now to wish that I had not brought my Lancashire husband from England at all. However, that wish was not hearty, for I loved my Lancashire husband entirely. The next morning my son came to visit me again, almost as soon as I was up. After a little discourse, he first of all pulled out a deerskin bag and gave it to me, with 55 Spanish pistoles in it, and told me that was to supply my expenses from England. Then he pulled out his grandmother's will and read it over to me, whereby it appeared that she had left a small plantation, as he called it, on York River. This plantation, though remote from him, he said he did not let out, but managed it by a head clerk. If I would live on it, then it would be worth much more, and he believed it would bring me in about £150 a year. But seeing I was likely either to settle on the other side of the bay, or might perhaps have a mind to go back to England again, if I would let him be my steward, he would manage it for me. This was all strange news to me, and things I had not been used to. And really my heart began to look up more seriously than I think it ever did before, and to look with great thankfulness to the hand of Providence, which had done such wonders for me, who had been myself the greatest wonder of wickedness. My son's tender carriage and kind offers fetched tears from me. I told him that as to the inheritance of it, I had no child but him in the world, and now was past having any, if I should marry, and therefore would desire him to get a writing drawn, which I was ready to execute, by which I would, after me, give it wholly to him and to his heirs. This was the substance of our first day's conversation, the pleasantest day that ever passed over my head in my life. I made him one present, and it was all I had of value, and that was one of the gold watches, of which I had 2 in my chest. I did not, indeed, tell him that I had stole it from a gentlewoman's side at a meeting-house in London, for that's by the way. The next day he brings me an obligation under his hand and seal, whereby he engaged himself to manage and improve the plantation for my account. I stayed here about 5 weeks, and indeed had much to do to get away then. Nay, he would have come over the bay with me, but I would by no means allow him to it. I then brought over with me, for the use of our plantation, 3 horses with harness, and saddles, and 1,000 other things. I related to my husband all the particulars of this voyage, except that I called my son my cousin. Then I let him know what I had brought over in the sloop, and from this time forward I believe he was as sincere a penitent and as thoroughly a reformed man as ever God's goodness brought back from a profligate. We were now in very considerable circumstances, and every year increasing, for our new plantation grew upon our hands insensibly. And in 8 year which we lived upon it, we brought it to such a pitch that the produce was, at least, £300 sterling a year. After I had been a year at home again, I went over the bay to see my son and to receive another year's income of my plantation, and I was surprised to hear, just at my landing there, that my old husband was dead. This, I confess, was not disagreeable news, because now I could appear as I was, in a married condition. So I told my son before I came from him that I believed I should marry a gentleman who had a plantation near mine. Some time after this, I let my son know I was married, and invited him over to see us. And my husband wrote a very obliging letter to him also, and he came, accordingly, some months after. It must be observed that when the old wretch, my brother, husband, was dead, I then freely gave my husband an account of all that affair, and of this cousin, as I had called him before, being my own son by that mistaken, unhappy match, and he was perfectly easy in the account. Thus all these little difficulties were made easy, and we lived together with the greatest kindness and comfort imaginable. We are now grown old. I am come back to England, being almost 70 years of age. my husband 68, having performed much more than the limited terms of my transportation. And now, notwithstanding all the fatigues and all the miseries we have both gone through, we are both in good heart and health. My husband remained in America some time after me to settle our affairs, and at first I had intended to go back to him. But at his desire I altered that resolution, and he has come over to England also, where we resolved to spend the remainder of our years in sincere penitence for the wicked lives we have lived.